Anti-Catholicism in America is probably as long and there's as much hatred towards Catholics in America as there are to Jews, if not more so. Um, so I study Catholic history and I'm currently doing research on anti-Catholicism. So bear with me because I'm probably going to get a little long-winded on this. So a brief history of anti-Catholicism prior to the 1920s. Catholics have always been viewed in America as someone who is a threat. That has just always been the perception by Protestants. So when we go back to our chart of immigrants, you'll notice that most Catholics are not considered white. And one of the reasons for this is because there has been a belief since the founding of America that Catholics could never be American, but rather that Catholics owed their allegiance to the Pope. So the Pope is the nominal head of the Catholic Church. He's supposed to be the one who says, okay, here's what we believe, here's how the church service should go, etc. In reality, the Pope has next to no power. Like, he's never really had any power. But Protestants don't actually understand this. And so they've often said, well, the Pope is trying to conquer America. And they've seen Catholics as a threat. And you can see this on the one image on the slide, which was from the turn of the 20th century from a political newspaper, Puck, where we see the Pope sitting on top of the one church in Rome, trying to get hold of America. And you can kind of see, it's very sinister. He's like, his shadow is very sinister. So there's always been this fear of Catholics. Up until around 1840, Catholics were denied citizenship in America. You could live here, you couldn't vote. In some places, you couldn't even own property. You could rent property, but you couldn't own it. Catholics were told that often they couldn't read their version of the Bible. So the Catholic Bible has a few extra books in it, and it's a different translation than the Protestant Bible. Well, the Catholic schools, which are known as parochial schools, would have their version of the Bible versus the Protestant Bible. And this led to so much unrest where there were lawsuits. There were even riots. These are known as the Bible riots of 1844, which mainly took place in Philadelphia, but there were a few other places that there were a few other places that had Bible riots. They were just over what version of the Bible can be in schools, because at that point in time, it was very commonplace to have a Bible in school. Anti-Catholic sentiment is also fueled by questions of what's going on in Catholic communities. So Catholics have groups of women known as nuns who live inside a convent, which is a women's only institution. And they live unmarried, and they live secluded from the world. And Protestant Americans have always been, well, wait, how do we respond to that? Because the Protestant American ideal is for a woman to get married. And so there's been a distrust of this. So there have been waves of backlash and actually riots that have occurred when we have what are called escaped nuns' tales. And that's actually what my research is currently working on right now. I'm looking at an escaped nun's tale from the late 1800s. But the most famous example of an escaped nun's tale is called The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, which was published in 1836. And it wasn't actually by a nun. It was a woman who claimed to be a nun. But everyone believed her. It was a great example of misinformation. And it caused riots across America and caused a school run by nuns to be burnt to the ground. So anti-Catholic sentiment has always been there. There have been these bouts of violence. There have also been political parties that have been dedicated to trying to make sure there have been the disenfranchisement of Catholics. So two of these parties are the Know Nothings and the American Protective Association. The Know Nothings were around in the 1850s, and their goal was to make sure that there were no immigrants and no Catholics who would be able to vote. The American Protective Association was actually only an anti-Catholic association, though there were so many Catholic immigrants, it kind of goes over into immigration. And it published this one newspaper that I'm using in my research, actually, that would publish all of this misinformation about Catholics, trying to get people riled up to burn Catholic places or to kill Catholics. And that actually was a big deal with the political party, the anti-Catholic political parties, that it wasn't just, okay, we want to disenfranchise Catholics. They were promoting the murder of Catholics. They were promoting burning down schools run by Catholics. They were promoting burning down convents where women religious lived. There was a violent rhetoric that has always been part of anti-Catholic sentiment in America that is very, you see that in racial sentiment, I should say, not anti-Black sentiment, but racial sentiment, but it is really, really clear in anti-Catholic sentiment. So after the American Civil War, there was kind of a shift a little bit with views on Catholics, particularly in terms of their role in society. Catholic women had actually really participated in the American Civil War. They had served as nurses for both sides of the Civil War. They had served as spies for both sides of the Civil War. But there was still this anti-Catholic sentiment, and there was still this fear of, okay, Rome wants to get hold of us. Rome wants to take over. And so the KKK builds upon that fear. And you can see that in the various slides that I have with KKK imagery. These were pro-KKK slides that were saying that they were protecting people from the Catholics. So I want you to look at these, and I want you to look at the imagery and how Catholics are portrayed, and how is the KKK portrayed? Okay, so this image needs a little bit more of a explanation than the other images. There had been a pushback against funding of Catholic schools. So because of Grant's peace policy, which allowed for religious organizations to run the Native American boarding schools, Catholics actually got funding for the Native American boarding schools. That's actually where some of my research has been in the past. And so in the 1880s and 1890s, there's this massive pushback saying, how dare you allow Catholics to run the Native American boarding schools? How dare you give federal funding to that? So beginning in the 1890s, there's a pushback to allow any federal funding to go to Catholic boarding schools or any Catholic schools in general. Because Catholics had been running the Native American boarding schools, they made the argument saying, well, why can't we have funding for our local schools? And they had started to get federal funding and state funding. Now, some of these schools were kind of, I wouldn't call them fully public schools, but they were schools that anyone can enroll in. Other schools were more specialized. So, for example, in Buffalo, New York, there was a school for the deaf, DEAF, that was funded in large part by the state of New York, but it was run by Catholic nuns. And so people were outraged at any Catholic school getting funding. So that's the background for this image.